This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm Jamie Bogan. This is podcast episode 241, and we are taking a different tactic than we would normally take here on the podcast this week. While we generally focus on the technical and the pragmatic for our audience of brewers, today we're going to back out a little bit and talk about theory and human development and evolution in the place of alcohol. In all of that, and joining me for the podcast this week is Edward Ted Slingerland, author of the book Drunk, also distinguished university scholar, professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia. Welcome to the podcast, Ted.
Thanks for having me.
I know I saw you on some other popular media last year as the book came out. You've certainly done bigger podcasts than this and done some television appearances. And yet, as I picked up your book and started reading it last year, I was struck by the argument that it made that the consumption of alcohol in the history of human evolution is not an accident. It's not a bug. It is a feature, as you will, that it's hard to separate the evolution of human species as a successful entity on this planet compared to other animal life forms. It's hard to separate that from the consumption of alcohol itself. It's an intriguing idea, especially for those of us who often find ourselves making apologies for alcohol here.
Yeah.
I want to dive in through this podcast and talk to you about the argument that you make and some of the research that you've done that backs up some of these arguments to kind of understand how it is that human evolution and alcohol are just inextricably combined. But before we do that, for nearly 30 years, G&D Chillers has set the mark for quality equipment you can rely on. G&D stands above the rest as the only chiller manufacturer that engineers your glycol piping for free. G&D also stands alone as the only chiller manufacturer with an in-house team of installers and engineers with 30 years of real-world field labor experience in breweries, wineries, and distilleries. Contact the Total Glycol System Design experts today at gdchillers.com. Also, support for this episode comes from BSG. Did you know that BSG sources hops directly from growers and processes them in their FSSC certified facility in Yakima Valley? From Azacca to Zappa, BSG's hops are pelletized for optimal dispersion in the boiler or FV and packaged in nitrogen flushed bags to preserve all of those tasty and enticing aromatics. To learn more about how your hops go from farmer to fermenter, get in touch with BSG at Let's Talk Hops at bsgcraft.com. So a little background on me. I've mentioned it in podcasts in the past, but I was a religious studies major in college and intended to become a Presbyterian minister as I went to school. Didn't work out that way. But I have, when I saw your background as a professor of philosophy, also with a large background also in the study of religion, found it particularly interesting and loved the fact that aligned with this subject of alcohol. But talk to me a little bit about what drove your interest in alcohol and the consumption of alcohol and this history of human evolution. What sparked the interest in this subject?
Yeah, there's a couple of different connections with my previous work. So my home field is early Chinese religion and philosophy, and I've worked a lot on this concept in early China. It's called Wu Wei. So effortless action is how I translate it. But it's a state, it's kind of like being in the zone. So you're in a state where you lose a sense of yourself as an agent, you're relaxed, you're completely unself-conscious, and yet everything you do works out. You're socially successful, you're successful in the physical world. So the early Chinese philosophers all want to get you into this state of spontaneity, but they have this problem that I call the paradox of spontaneity or the paradox of Wu Wei, which is how do you try not to try? So that's my first trade book is called Trying Not to Try, and it's about this paradox. And it is a genuine cognitive paradox. When I tell you relax or be cool, don't try so hard.
Sure.
The part of your brain that I'm activating is actually the part that needs to get shut down. It's the prefrontal cortex, the center of cognitive control. And so the early Chinese philosophers have all these different techniques for trying to get around this paradox. So meditation, breathing techniques, or using ritual. But there's one story in this Taoist text where physical drunkenness, being drunk on alcohol, is used as a metaphor for this state of wu wei. And it occurred to me that, hey, maybe alcohol is a cultural technology that people have developed for getting around this paradox. Because you can't, if I tell you, hey, try to relax, it's going to be counterproductive. If I hand you a beer and let you sit and drink it for an hour, maybe that'll work. It's a way to kind of directly reach into it. You can't directly shut down your prefrontal cortex through your own prefrontal cortex. So this is a tool for kind of reaching in and dialing it down a couple notches. So that's what got me interested in the possible cultural social functions of alcohol.
This subject of creativity and, as you say, trying not to try, is one I was just listening to on another podcast, as they had a creativity expert, stating the same kind of argument that conscious effort is actually counterproductive, and that most creative breakthroughs come when you are not focused on that when the mind wanders. Mm-hmm. That's certainly an argument that you make also in the book, and that this prefrontal cortex, which is an amazing piece of the brain for accomplishing, all sorts of executive tasks, for being, functional and being, productive and efficient, and able to accomplish things that we need to accomplish as humans. Incredibly important for that, but also directly conflicts with our need to think in nonlinear ways, or ways outside of that, direct executive function.
Yeah, so the PFC is really crucial, as you say, for certain tasks, like linear algorithmic tasks where you need to focus. It's very clear how you're going to, what needs to get done to get from A to B, and we need it. So evolution has this kind of design tension where we need to have fully functioning PFCs to get to work on time, to get our jobs done, to function as adults. But then there are certain tasks, creativity, so tasks that involve lateral thinking, or thinking outside the box. Also social trust. So, being open to other people and learning to trust other people. In these cases, the PFC is actually a problem. So evolution kind of was like, well, we got to give them a PFC. And then what humans, being clever, have figured out how to do is say, okay, we have PFCs. It's a good thing. But in certain situations where maybe it's getting in the way, that part of the brain is being counterproductive, let's figure out ways to turn it down. And there are various ways we can do that, but the easiest and most effective is ethanol.
That's pretty fascinating. So walk me then through this. Then this basic thesis is that alcohol itself has become this evolutionary adaptation with human beings to turn off that part of the PFC when it's necessary to do that for whatever that problem solving or creative thinking is, and then we can pop it back into PFC mode, when necessary to operate in that kind of way. How do you look at this and, in a historical sense, and walk me through this kind of timeline of early human evolution as we started to become humans, and what some of that functioning allowed to happen in the very earliest days of humanity?
Yeah, so the standard story about alcohol from a scientific perspective is that it's just it's an evolutionary mistake. So it's a byproduct. The standard, the most common theory is basically a hijack theory. So ethanol hijacks reward networks in the brain that evolve for other reasons. And it's just, we're clever primates. We figure out we can pick this pleasure lock with this substance, and so that's why we use alcohol. So in that sense, it's like junk food or masturbation. There's all sorts of evolutionary mistakes. The most vices that humans get involved in involve this kind of either misuse or hijacking of a pleasure network in the brain that evolved for other reasons. I became, when I started looking into the science and the history of alcohol, I became really dubious about this story, just because, the two things about alcohol, one is the high costs. So it's really it's a really dangerous substance. It's got all
Sure.
these health problems. It can lead to all these social problems. So unlike, for instance, masturbation, it's extremely costly. It's also, unlike junk food, ancient. Humans have been producing and consuming alcohol. And this is something I really didn't realize until I started doing the research for the book. We've been producing and consuming alcohol for as long as we've been doing anything as a species in an organized fashion, before even agriculture. So,
Right.
so the surprising thing, once I started digging into the history, I always thought, again, the standard story is, we invented agriculture, we started living in these large scale communities. And then at a certain point, again, a kind of mistake story, someone left some, porridge sitting out too long and it started to ferment, and we tasted it and it made us feel good. And we thought, oh, this is cool. Let's start making this deliberately. So the standard story is that alcohol production was kind of a byproduct or mistake after agriculture. But if you look at the data, it actually seems that human beings were gathering together, producing alcohol, engaging in these large scale festivals way before agriculture. So they were deliberately coming together and producing alcohol, not only before agriculture, but the suggestion is that the desire to produce more and better alcohol may have been the impetus to actually settle down and start growing crops deliberately in the first place.
Creating alcohol at that point would have been incredibly resource intensive, like massively resource intensive for, nomadic hunter gatherers. And come at a huge cost, where what they are potentially using to create alcohol then is something that they are not ingesting as calories to keep themselves alive. And when you are a nomadic hunter gatherer, in 10,000 BCE, I mean, that's a humongous decision to make at that point.
Yeah, it's, well, as you know, especially making beers is technically pretty challenging. There are a lot of steps involved. You're not giving up calories necessarily. So there are some advantages to taking grain and converting it into alcohol. It's got a lot of calories. There's also what's called biological ennoblement. So one theory about early agricultural societies is that the way they managed to survive on very monotonous diets. So once we move from being hunter-gatherers to settling down, in the Fertile Crescent into these agricultural communities, your average person's diet got really crappy. I mean, they used to, as hunter-gatherers, they were eating, fruits, vegetables, meats, and then suddenly they're living on a diet of bread, mostly bread. And it's a bit of a puzzle why they didn't get sick without nutrients. And one of the theories is that it's because they were drinking beer as well. Because when you ferment beer, you actually create a bunch of micronutrients that are very important. So there is, once we get into settled societies, alcohol is playing a function in terms of providing us with some nutrition and important vitamins. But I think the really crucial part is that it's the motivation for doing that in the first place. So if you, not just in the Fertile Crescent, if you look around the world, you see that the first cultivated plants are being cultivated for their psychoactive properties, not for their nutrition. So in South America, teosinte, which is the ancestor to maize, to corn, got cultivated, and it didn't get cultivated for making tortillas or bread, because teosinte makes terrible, it doesn't make very good bread products.
Yeah.
What it does make is really good beer. So chicha, this fermented beverage that they make now out of maize. So basically no one would have noticed this plant if they weren't interested in alcohol production and not grain production. And again, other parts of the world, you see the same thing. The first cultivated plants, people seem to be attracted to because they do something to their mind.
Sure. I want to get in and talk a little bit about why that is and what it was that made, early humans then, focus on this. What kind of adaptations that might have allowed in that human population that would allow them to thrive? Because, even at that point, as a part of a primate family, there are lots of other animals that could have certainly thrived in the same kind of way for various other reasons. And I think there's this interesting element that allows alcohol, in conjunction with human beings to make some of the steps, certainly socially. Let's talk a little bit about that. But first, is your brewery struggling to source or afford berry ingredients? Historic heat waves devastated U.S. berry crops, causing supply to dwindle and prices to skyrocket. That's why brewers are switching over to Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends, which mimic straight concentrates, but at a better price point and with a more reliable supply. Is it any surprise that Old Orchard's best sellers are raspberry and blackberry flavors? Reclaim your margins and order your craft concentrates at oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, as craft beer's most trusted point-of-sale system, Arrived is the mobile all-in-one solution you need to decrease service friction and increase guest satisfaction. With a full suite of craft-specific features, no contracts, and no monthly fees, Arrived provides the necessary tools to help your brewery grow. Go to arrived.com/CBB to set up a free customized demo. That's Arrived, ARRYVED.com/CBB. Remember, there is no I in Arrived. So Ted, let's talk about that. Clearly, early humans were putting a lot of resources into alcohol, creating alcohol, ethanol-based alcohol in various ways. What then, is this step that allowed human species to take that allowed it to say jumpstart or throw into warp speed this development of human beings as then what is now the most dominant species on the planet?
We're a weird species. We're a very weird primate. And so part of what I have to explore in Drunk is, if I'm arguing alcohol's adaptive, I've got to explain what our ecological niche is that it's helping us adapt to. And the ecological niche that humans fill is unusual. One of the features is that we're creative and we're dependent on creativity. So we're tool users. Human beings cannot live without tools. We literally cannot live without fire, right? Which is a tool. And then, all these various tools we invent for hunting and gathering, and processing food, and all the way up to this laptop, we're talking on now. So, we depend on tools, and having tools requires creativity. You're always innovating with tool sets. You're competing against other cultural groups who are innovating in their tool sets. And if they do a better job than you, you're in trouble. So we're dependent on this kind of lateral thinking creativity. So, I talked about this tension. We've got to have a PFC to be able to get out of bed and get to work on time and do our job, but we need creativity. So one thing alcohol allowed was for people to temporarily, essentially reverse the development of our brains. So we're very creative. We're very good at lateral thinking when we're 4 years old, but we also have no PFC, right? We can't tie our shoes. We can't focus. And as people grow up until actually the PFC doesn't fully mature until you're in your 20s, one of the things, your creativity goes down. So if you want to think about one function of alcohol, it's reversing that developmental process. It's taking us back temporarily to having the kind of flexibility that a 4-year-old has, but only for a couple hours. And then we pop out of it and we're grown-ups again. And we can take advantage of those insights and do something useful with them. So that's one special feature of us as a species. The other feature is that we're communal. We cooperate on a scale, especially in large scale societies, that other primates could never pull off. So our nearest relatives, chimpanzees, live in small bands. They're very suspicious and hostile toward strangers. The primatologist Sarah Laffer-Hardy has this famous chapter of a book called Apes on a Plane. She talks about the fact that if you put a bunch of chimps, you try to get a bunch of chimps to sit still in economy class, the plane would pull up the other end and you just have a tube full of body parts and blood. They would just tear each other apart because primates do not cooperate with strangers. Humans cooperate with strangers. Humans are like
despite some factions of our humanity's idea that we can be solo operators and somehow successful without a community, or they are in that kind of element. You're right that this communal aspect is what has produced the success of humanity, and how you define that compared to other primates. What we might define as individuality is, in a sense, much more communal than we might want to admit that it is.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's this myth, especially in America, and kind of it started in Northern Europe, this myth of individuality that we kind of invent things on our own. And society started when we were wandering alone in the woods and we met in a clearing and shook hands and decided to form a society. That's absurd. We're pack animals, and we've always been pack animals. But we're funny because the biology we have is very much primate biology. But culture and various cultural technologies has given us these tools that allow us trick our brains into essentially expanding our cooperation network, expanding our families. One of those tools is religion. So a lot of my previous work focused on how certain types of religious beliefs and practices allow us to trust others more readily and fuse with others into a larger social group. But another important tool is alcohol. So another benefit of turning down the PFC is it makes you both more trustworthy. It's harder for you to lie. So lying is a cognitively really demanding thing to do. If I'm lying to you about something, I've got to keep in my brain at the same time what I'm telling you is true and also what I know to be true. I've got to suppress any facial expressions or emotions that are inconsistent with what I'm telling you to be true, even though they may be happening in my brain. It's really hard. Lying really requires your PFC to be in top shape. You impair the PFC, you make it hard for people to lie. So one analogy I use is in the same way where hostile adults who need to cooperate on something will shake hands to show they're not carrying a weapon. They'll then sit down and start drinking alcohol. And that's the same function. You're basically reaching into your brain, taking out your PFC and putting it on the table and saying, I'm cognitively disarmed. And so you can trust the things that I'm saying. So alcohol has been this very important tool in cognitively disarming people so that they could get past cooperation dilemmas. It also is ramping up endorphins and serotonin, feel-good chemicals. So you're liking the people you're with more than you would otherwise. You're liking yourself more. You're feeling expansive and good about yourself. So it's been a crucial tool as well for getting basically selfish, suspicious primates, which is what we are at some level, to more easily cooperate on a large scale.
I loved the point you made about this bit of evolutionary arms race that we're in, especially when it comes to lying, and that our ability to lie moves hand in hand in an evolutionary scale with our ability to detect lies. Mm-hmm. And I think that, as you watch this, we become better and better at lying, but we also become better and better at detecting smaller and smaller and smaller micro signals of that lying, and so regardless, getting into that disarming point of alcohol consumption through the history of human social interaction, alcohol has been used as in that very same function, socially, to bring down barriers and to create spaces of trust, through important events and whatnot.
Yeah, that's why you see there was a prediction when Skype got invented, right? That people would just stop traveling for business. Like, why would you fly from London to Shanghai to sign a contract when you could just do it over Skype? And yet people kept traveling. I mean, it took the global pandemic to have any effect on business travel. And I predict that business travel is going to bounce right back once the pandemic's fully over. Right. And that's because this has been, all throughout the history of human beings, human civilization, anytime you get potentially hostile individuals sitting down and having to come to some sort of agreement, or at least individuals who might have different interests, the alcohol comes out or some similar substance. So in the few parts of the world where they don't have alcohol, they have some other substance that does the same thing, kava, or in some cases, hallucinogen-laced tobaccos. And that's revealing too. So when you don't have alcohol, you need to find something else that'll serve the same function. So this has been, there's a very real sense in which alcohol has been this kind of glue that has helped keep societies together and keep civilizations together.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think it's interesting when we look at it, even from a, kind of a sensory standpoint, the technology always keeps up with the evolutionary adaptations. I mean, I think about it in terms of, like we've talked about it here on the podcast, whether it's taste sensory, whether it's visual sensory, all of these senses are developing constantly. I mean, our ability to identify and parse smaller and smaller details now is getting to the point where we have 300 DPI screens on our handheld devices,
right?
Where but I even look at it in a sense, like if I look back at digital photos taken from the early 2000s, they look like old pictures.
Yeah.
And, even though the pixels are the exact same data that they were in 2000 when I took those digital pictures, they feel old because our demand and expectation for things like contrast and vibrance and color saturation, because of the technology that we have and what we're constantly being fed in this kind of sensory realm, is so much more heightened. And so even then, even though it was the exact same thing, we perceived it differently then than we do now based on this kind of changing evolutionary context. Same thing happens with flavor. We have ideas of what things tasted like, and now our lexicon for flavors is so much more broad than it might have been 20 or 30 years ago. And the inputs that we have constantly, and even the evolution of our food supply and food producers trying to heighten and create higher and higher expectations of these things, it just changes that context that we approach it from. And it's interesting in that same kind of way, right? We have these technologies, but a digital technology that connects us still makes it, and even in a business or in an interpersonal sense, that much more impactful or important to make that, face-to-face, personal, individual connection. And so even though we think we're going to get away from these things, it still becomes such an important part of just that baseline idea of being human.
Yeah, no, the real world is always where we live. And so digital technologies can fill in for some things, but whenever it comes to important decisions or something where we really need to know the people we're dealing with, we want to see them in person. We want to, and you're missing, I mean, even right now, we've got a great internet connection, it's a really nice interface. Our timing is going to be slightly off because even the slightest delay, conversations, the way people time conversations is on the microsecond level, where I'm picking up cues that you're done talking and I can talk now, or I can get a sense of, you're getting a little bored, maybe I should change topics. All that gets screwed up with even the slightest time delay. And then it gets much worse when I don't have all your body language, right? I can't see everything you're doing. So people are always going to want to meet in person. And then, in order to get over then the potential tensions or hostilities or distrust that happens when you put a bunch of primates in close quarters together, you're going to need some technology for tamping that down and relaxing people. So it's, this is why chemical intoxicants in general and alcohol in particular have been just ubiquitous features. Anywhere you find humans, you find them drinking socially.
And that was an interesting point that you make in the book about a study with rats and, consuming alcohol and finding that close quarter and chronic stress seems to lead to, greater alcohol consumption, that it becomes this mode of allowing for tighter quarters and concentration of humanity. So in that sense, if you extrapolate from that, as human populations increased, alcohol can certainly be seen as this technological mechanism that allowed humans to exist in closer, consistent contact with each other.
Yeah. So it's, ironically, so the desire to produce more and better alcohol caused us to settle down in these very dense communities where suddenly we're shoulder to shoulder with other people. But then served as a tool that helped us cope with that. So alcohol's got a bunch of functions that are all happening simultaneously. And that's one of them it's just basic stress reduction. So again, people use alcohol socially to help get along in situations where there might be tensions or distrust. They also use it at the end of the day, to relax from the day of work, to make the transition from PFC dominated work mode where you're focused, you're getting things done, you're moving from A to B, to a more relaxed, expansive state that you want to tend to have, for instance, with your family at the end of the day. This again is something humans have been doing forever. So it's got, alcohol's got a bunch of different functions. They overlap to a certain extent, but the really crucial takeaway, I think, is that it's not our desire to drink, and the fact that we've been making alcohol is not an evolutionary mistake, and it's not simply a vice. It actually has all of these important functions, and the fact that we haven't seen that, I think, has really impoverished our discussions about alcohol, because we've seeing it as basically the equivalent of pornography or cocaine or Twinkies has made it impossible for us to really talk intelligently about costs and benefits of alcohol and what role it should play in our lives. So it's important to have that functional piece.
Well, as a cheerleader and apologist for craft beer, you are speaking my language on this. And we can talk, I want to talk a little bit about, some of those lines, because clearly there are lines, in that consumption of alcohol where up to a point it can be productive, and then past a certain point it can flip and have more negative results. Before we do that, from the rotatable pickup tube on Rogue Brewing's pilot brew house to the integrated hopbacks on Sierra Nevada's twin prototyping brew houses, SS Brewtech has taken technology they invented working with world-renowned industry veterans and made them available to every craft brewer. To learn more about SS Brewtech's innovation list, head on over to ssbrewtech.com. So you mentioned that often cultures have that expectation with alcohol consumption. Also comes understanding the limits of that. And, this kind of, especially when you're speaking about truthfulness, there is this point where being able to consume alcohol, but also understand one's limits and operate within one's limits becomes a culturally prized behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so alcohol is two-faced in certain ways. And I talk about this in terms of the Greek god Dionysus, where he can give you these amazing gifts, but you also have to be careful about them. So he's the one who gave Midas the golden touch, right? Which seemed like a good idea, but turned out not to be. So the Greeks were worshipped Dionysus, but were also wary of him. They realized he could be dangerous. And you see this same kind of ambivalence about alcohol in every culture. So in ancient China, they celebrate, these early poems celebrate the power of alcohol to bring people together, to gladden the heart, to make the ancestors happy when you sacrifice it to them. Right alongside these warnings about drunkenness and excessive drinking and chaos. So people have always been aware that alcohol is a dangerous substance. Historically, we've had a couple techniques for keeping it safer than it is recently. So part of the argument of the book is actually alcohol has become more dangerous recently than it's been for our evolutionary history. So the two safety features are, first of all, just natural limits to fermentation. So as you know, you guys brewers, there's a limit to how strong you can get a beer or wine, right? At a certain point, the yeast start to poison themselves and just shut down. Now, people in your industry have been ruthlessly driving yeast to become more and more resistant to alcohol. So, you can get craft. I don't know, what's the most powerful craft beer you can get now?
Oh, we can get into decent beer fermentation into the low 20s range. So
that's crazy.
Even above the wine. There are plenty of tricks.
So more than wine. Okay. Wow.
Using enzymes to kind of promote this fermentation and, turbocharge those yeast. You can do that. But 15%, it's generally that kind of top end for most beer yeasts. But having said that, like even recently, and there was that moment earlier in the last decade where, brewers were in that arms race to see how big they could make something. And thank goodness we've turned a bit of a corner on that and are settling back in as more people discover lagers and 4 and 5% beers, and the beauty of more thoughtful and artful execution and beers that you can drink more of quantity without going down this kind of dark rabbit hole. But I
yeah,
digress.
well, that's what we're designed to drink, basically. So we spent most of our evolutionary history drinking beers and in some degree fruit wines that came in. The beers typically came in at 2-3% ABV.
Right.
The grape wines higher, but not that high. And so alcohol came with a kind of built-in safety feature. It's really hard to get dangerously drunk on a 2-3% beer, especially if you're sipping it in a social situation. So that's one of the features that's made alcohol relatively safe that got completely removed when we invented distillation. So one of the new, and this is new, and this I didn't quite realize this until I was doing the research for the book. We think of distilled spirits as always being around. Distillation as a concept has been understood forever. Aristotle wrote about it, and the early Chinese knew about it. But it's technically hard to pull off. You need to have, be able to make vessels that can hold liquids under heat. You need to be able to control temperature carefully. So we really didn't pull off distillation.
And it's very possible if you don't have that technology to create something that will just kill you.
Yeah. So it's really dangerous.
You can make methanol rather than ethanol, and then you're just going to poison yourself.
You're going to poison yourself. So we didn't have safe to drink distilled spirits on a large scale until China probably figured it out first. So their thoughts are maybe 14th century. In Europe, it really wasn't until the 16th, 17th century that we had distilled liquors on a large scale. So distillation is a basically we invented it yesterday, compared to this evolutionary story I'm telling, where 10 million years ago we had primate ancestors who adapted to eating fermenting fruit on the ground, and then humans invent beers and wines. We've started brewing beers definitely by 13,000 years ago.
Wow.
And wines maybe almost as old as that. So I have a timeline when I give a talk on this that expands and shows kind of how long our history with alcohol is and how tiny a sliver of that period we've had distilled alcohols. So once you can take, basically circumvent the natural limits of fermentation and get something that's like 90 something ABV, it's really a different drug. And so one of the arguments of the book is that even though distilled liquors are still just ethanol, we should really think about them as almost a different type of drug, because alcohol at that concentration is so dangerous. If you're doing shots of vodka or tequila, you can very rapidly move right through the sweet spot. So most of the benefits of alcohol seem to come at about 0.08 BAC. So that's when you're probably around when you should not drive. It's usually where the legal limit is for driving.
Sure.
You're drinking a session beer or, sipping wine. You can kind of stay at that level indefinitely. You're doing shots of
one
tequila.
1.5 an hour for most people with normal body weights, or if you weigh what I do, maybe 2, 2 an hour,
it depends on if you have food in your stomach.
Sure.
And, there's lots of variables, but basically in normal social drinking, you'll stay at about that. You'll top out at about that. You're doing shots of tequila, you blow right past 0.08 into very dangerous territory very quickly. So we're just not evolutionarily designed to deal with alcohol at that concentration. What we really have kind of grown up with as a species is, traditional beer levels. So 2, 3, 4, maybe 5% ABV. And that, makes it easier to drink safely when you're drinking something like that. The other important safety feature, is that alcohol consumption has always been social. And it's always been socially regulated in various ways. Having private access to alcohol is actually historically quite rare. Typically, the only way you would get to drink is communally. It'd be stored in a central place. Everyone would gather and drink. Typically, drinking is regulated ritually. So in ancient Greece, the symposium, this wine party, was regulated by the symposiarch, the person in charge of it. And they'd be in charge of watering down the wine, like deciding what concentration to get it at.
Yeah.
They would decide when to pass the wine around. So if things were getting out of hand, they would wait a little longer. If things were slowing down, maybe they'd make it stronger, pass it more quickly. In traditional China, and actually even today at Chinese banquets, you don't drink at will. You only drink when a toast is made. And certain people are ritually allowed to make toasts. And so that's another way to control alcohol consumption. And even if you think about what seem like really informal, modern European situations, you're out having beers at the pub with your friends, there's regulation going on, right? If I finish my beer really quickly, I got to wait for you guys to finish because we order rounds, right? You don't just order at will. That keeps kind of people in step with their drinking. If I'm having too many cocktails, having too many glasses of wine too quickly, the waiter may say, may actually avoid my table
Sure.
for a little bit,
Sure.
right? There are various ways you can kind of slow people down. Even around the dinner table, you help yourself too quickly to another glass of wine. Your mother-in-law gives you the stink eye from across the table. So we have all these subtle ways where we regulate each other's alcohol consumption, it's really hard for individuals by themselves to do that. And so a new development that's really dangerous is drinking alone. The fact that people have private access to alcohol. I can sit alone in my apartment and I've got all this cold wine in the fridge, and I can just top myself off whenever I want. It's very hard for humans because alcohol is super addictive. That's one of the most dangerous things about it, is it's really physically addictive substance. We're not evolutionarily designed to be drinking 90-something ABV liquids. We're also not evolutionarily designed to be drinking alone. And modern life has made that possible for the first time. And so that's the two, I call them the dangers of isolation and distillation, are the kind of twin banes of modern existence. And then we've seen this kind of turbocharged during COVID, right?
Sure,
People in COVID lockdowns. I could get, I couldn't leave my house, but I could get a case of liquor delivered to my apartment. enough liquor to like kill a small village I could just have in my house. That's crazy.
Well, at the same time, we have this, external pressure, and stressor of, the world events causing certain people to try to find some coping mechanism for it. And so it definitely, and this inability to find those kinds of social connections, even in some senses, social media glorification of excessive consumption on an individual level, as we try to find some way to socially connect with each other using these kinds of remote technologies.
Yeah. No, drinking got incredibly unhealthy during COVID. There's good data on that now, that drinking, people drink a lot more, they drink more heavily, they drink more distilled liquors. And the problem is, because alcohol is so physically addictive, it's going to be hard for people to reverse that. Once you ramp up your alcohol consumption, it's hard to go back. But hopefully, as people, we're emerging from lockdowns, people are able to go to pubs again. Hopefully those social controls will start to reassert themselves, and we'll slot back into a more healthy drinking pattern.
Sure. What is it about that 0.08 like blood alcohol level that makes it so optimized? And why is riding that line, or hitting that kind of narrow window? What is it about that amount that provides the kind of perfect basis for overcoming some of those prefrontal cortex negative impacts, increasing this kind of trust thing and pushing that social element? Or in some cases, driving, I know you mentioned the Balmer peak, that idea that having the right amount of alcohol in your system makes you a better coder if you're Steve Ballmer of Microsoft. What is it about that like thin band that that makes it so effective to ride that space?
It's just it's the right balance between control and loss of control. You're not stupid drunk, you're not slurring your words, you're not being dumb, but your PFC is relaxed. Your endorphins, serotonins are pumped up. You haven't fallen into the strongly depressive arm of alcohol inebriation. So alcohol is both a stimulant and a depressant at the same time, right. But the depressant effects become dominant if you drink a lot more, and especially if you're drinking really heavily. So it just seems to be the sweet spot. What you want is the right balance between control and lack of control, and 0.08 seems to get you there.
Yeah. And there's this kind of, what you mentioned, a peak and kind of decline effect where the that depressive element of alcohol tends to kick in as, either you've consumed too much or you've stopped then consuming and you're starting not seeing as many of the positive aspects while you're still consuming. Talk to me about how that works.
Alcohol is really complex physiologically. So Stephen Brown, the journalist, has referred to it as a pharmacological hand grenade. So you've got things like cocaine or LSD that are going in and doing very specific things to the brain. They're affecting one network in a very predictable way. Alcohol it's almost like a little kid playing the piano and hitting all the keys at once. It's doing all these different things at the same time. So it's, releasing these feel-good hormones, serotonin, dopamine. It's down-regulating the PFC. Then it starts to have depressant effects on motor functions. This is why, you start to stumble or slur your words when you've had too much. And it also, as it hits your system, it's getting furiously broken down. We have all this machinery to latch onto alcohol as soon as it comes into our body and try to break it down and get rid of it. Our body's trying to do that. We're breaking it down. So there's some very complex, both multiple cognitive effects happening, but then the mix of them changes over time. And that's all affected by how quickly you're drinking, how strong the alcohol you're drinking is, what your tolerance is, do you have food in your stomach? So it has complicated effects on humans. But the reason I argue that I call alcohol the king of intoxicants, and it's because it's got these advantages that other chemical intoxicants don't have. So it is relatively easy to dose. If you know what you're drinking, you live in a culture where you have a beer that you drink, you know how much you can drink. It's easy to dose. It has very quick effects. You start drinking it and you'll start feeling something in a few minutes. It's got a relatively short half-life. So because we have this machinery that's dedicated to breaking it down, if you stop drinking, the effects fade pretty quickly compared to other drugs. And it does seem to have similar effects across individuals. And so this is where other drugs like cannabis has advantages. Cannabis is not physically addictive the way alcohol is. It's also probably better for you physiologically than alcohol is, but it has really variable effects across individuals. So it makes some people really extroverted and energetic. It makes me paranoid and makes me want to go to sleep. So it's not really a party drug for me. So that's challenging. It's hard to dose.
Some long-lasting physiological memory impacts.
It can impact your memory. It's hard to dose because if you're smoking it, you got to know how to hold it in your lungs. If you're doing edibles, that it takes so long for it to come on that it's hard to judge the dosage.
With edibles, we've created the distillation equivalent of for cannabis right there.
Plus the strains obviously are so much more powerful than what we were smoking earlier. But I argue in the book that if you gave a group of cultural engineers this task, you said, look, we need this. We need a substance that's easy to make. It's easy to discover by accident. So cultures can kind of stumble upon it. You can make it out of anything. It'll have similar effects across individuals. It'll come on fast, but also disappear quickly. They'd invent something very much like alcohol. So it's no accident that it's become the dominant cultural tool for having these functional effects.
In some ways, there probably is an evolutionary reason why it is that way with, human beings, that in 10,000 years from now, as humans continue to develop, we may develop the systems to break down cannabis in a different kind of way and metabolize it differently, but we are the humans that we are now, having spent the last 14,000 years living with and consuming alcohol and building a physiological systems and naturally selecting out bodies that now can process in that kind of way. It's a strange one to kind of think about how these things that we've consumed in the environment have shaped us as much as we have created them, working together in that kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, cannabis has been around with us for a long time as well.
Sure.
Thousands and thousands of years. But it just seems to be the case that chemically it's harder for a body to deal with. And we don't have the same, we have these primate ancestors that have been dealing with ethanol forever. So we had something to start with when it came to alcohol. But yeah, it's hard to know, one possibility I consider in the book. So one of the arguments I have against the evolutionary mistake argument is that alcohol is so costly that you would think there would be pressure to create a solution to the problem of our taste for alcohol. And sometimes in evolution, there just is no solution. Natural, random variation doesn't turn up a variant that gives you the solution you want. But in the case of alcohol, there actually is a solution to alcohol. There's a set of mutations that probably evolved about 7,000 years ago, originally in Southeast China. And it gives you that flushing reaction when you drink alcohol. Right. A chemical that simulates this effect is actually used to treat alcoholism, because when you have this gene variant, you don't like to drink alcohol. It makes you nauseous. It makes you flush. It gives you heart palpitations. And so if alcohol were only a kind of parasite evolutionarily, if it was only this kind of negative byproduct, you'd expect this gene complex to spread everywhere because it's the solution to this problem of the taste for alcohol. And yet it's stayed put in East Asia. It spread a little bit to what we now think of Japan and Korea, but it's not very widespread. And it actually evolved independently in parts of Europe and the Mideast, and also remain relatively constrained. So we have this kind of genetic solution to the quote unquote problem of alcohol that hasn't taken off. But
if there was an evolutionary benefit to that, then we would all have it by now.
Yeah, if there were no positive aspects to alcohol and it was just all costs, this gene variant should be everywhere by now, but it's not. And that suggests that in addition to the obvious costs, there are these countervailing benefits. So people who have this gene variant won't get alcoholism, which is great, but they also won't enjoy these other benefits. They won't enjoy the enhanced creativity. They won't enjoy the enhanced trust. And so there's benefits to alcohol that are paying for the costs that keep this gene variation from spreading all over the world. But there's a group of researchers who have suggested that it is spreading more recently, kind of in recent centuries. And it would be interesting if it's the case that with these new dangers like distilled alcohol, the kind of balance between cost and benefit has changed a little bit. And so therefore, we're going to see this gene variant becoming more prevalent. That's a possibility.
It's a really interesting but crazy one to think about. That and I look at it even like the tick that's now spreading throughout the southern and southwestern United States, where it makes people allergic to meat.
Really?
And so,
okay.
Or red meat, right? And so these. You watch nature work in mysterious ways to accomplish goals.
That could become adaptive, right? In an environment where too much red meat consumption is a problem. Yeah.
So then, where do we go from here? What is the near term future of alcohol look like? And clearly now that looking at it from this perspective, looking at how alcohol isn't something that we need to necessarily make apologies for, that certainly there are negatives to the behavior that involve excessive alcohol consumption, and that modes of that consumption, especially modes that focus on social consumption more so than individual consumption, become much more positive ways to do that. All of these are great for our audience of craft brewers, because I think that social element to this and being in that public space and enjoying together is something that most enjoy, and that and if we look at where craft beer is right now today, over the last decade and a half of development, it has become very focused on the spaces where people consume that craft beer, the places, the tap rooms, going and drinking together and exploring the creativity of a brewer in a place and feeling the environment itself, and doing that with each other, and socializing through that process where we can regulate each other, but also we can enjoy the experience with each other. There's so much of what craft beer looks like today that does seem to align, with what this kind of evolutionary past and example suggests for us. Where do you see alcohol consumption moving in the future? And are there some takeaways for those that are building these experiences that involve alcohol that that they can use to help people consume in the most evolutionary advantageous kind of way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the book, I have a bunch of takeaways. We understand the history of our relationship with alcohol as a species, understanding the benefits, but also the dangers, understanding how some of those dangers have become more extreme recently. Give us some actionable things we can do. So the first one, which I think your listeners will like, is drink more beer.
You heard it from Ted. Drink more beer. Drink less more of other things.
Yeah, no, I'm not a beer person. I will come out and say I'm not a fan of beer, or I haven't been. I'm more into wine. But one takeaway is, if you're drinking, drink relatively low ABV substances. And beer really seems to hit that sweet spot. Anywhere from like 3 to maybe 6% ABV seems perfect for keeping people where they want to be. So I've started drinking more beer. I've started actually organized a work thing for some new people who are part of this research team, and consciously chose to do it at a pub where they had beer, because of what I've learned right in this book, that keeping people, you want to keep people right around that 0.08 level. Beer is a safe substance to do that. So drink lower alcoholic beverages. Drink beers that come in at a normal alcohol level. So, we talked about this kind of crazy arms race where you're trying to get 20% ABV beers. It's just, it doesn't taste good. And it basically negates the benefits of beer, which is that it's got moderate alcohol content. So that's
the good news about those beers is they tend to be so expensive that no one drinks them by themselves. They simply get together in larger groups to share small 1 or 2 ounce pours of them together. I mean, it's in many ways like that, the high end of the wine world where you'd never want to open $1,000 bottle by yourself, right? It's only valuable in that social sphere of showing off to one's friends and showing how accomplished or how excellent one's taste might be. And so the consumption modes are a little different in that, but I understand what you're saying.
But it also seems like someone told me that in the craft brewing industry, there has been a movement toward like session beers where they're deliberately lower alcohol levels so that you can drink them continuously with your friends and stay at a safe level.
It's been a big move. And, for a long time in craft beer was positioned against the idea of mass-produced lager made by large brewers like Anheuser-Busch InBev. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways that craft beer was able to distinguish itself was by being higher ABV or more intense flavor, more bitterness, more in every kind of way. And I think that, it's an interesting thing about where we are with craft beer now. Over the last 5 years or so, craft beer has just gotten comfortable with beer itself, and and more brewers, because brewers drink a lot of beer while making a lot of beer, they also like to continue to consume. And, what we found over the last decade, brewers love themselves to drink lager beer because a 5% beer, you can drink, a couple of them every hour and still keep your head on. And, and now what we're seeing is that that passion for what these beers are is passing from brewers to the consumers. And it's a great dynamic to watch.
Yeah, so that basically is a return to a more evolutionarily healthy strategy. It's a return to the way we've been using alcohol historically as a species. So that's an important takeaway. Another is drink socially. Don't drink alone. When humans drink together in a pub environment, anything where you have people coming together, especially if you've got food as well, it's just a much more safe environment to consume alcohol. There's also the tricky things to be negotiated around dealing with non-drinkers. And so, one of the dangers of alcohol is that it creates, if you're in a drinking situation, you're almost inevitably marginalizing people who, for whatever reason, don't drink. Maybe they're pregnant, maybe they're recovering alcoholic, maybe they're Muslim, maybe they just don't like alcohol. And it really could disadvantage people like that. So I think another important thing, in order to kind of recover the benefits of alcohol without reintroducing some of the dangers of the way it's been used historically, is to try to level the playing field between drinkers and non-drinkers. And one of the ways you can do that is have really tasty, appealing, non-alcoholic options available. And it seems like, again, the craft brewing industry, you guys have gotten better at making low or no alcohol beers that actually look and still taste like beer. So that, having that as an option for people helps level the playing field. Having one of the things I talk about in the book is this tension between what anthropologists have called northern versus southern drinking cultures. And they're talking about Europe here. So northern drinking cultures, think of Germany, Scandinavia, and the US inherited this. You drink to get drunk. It's mainly men drinking together. You're drinking a lot of distilled liquors. Being drunk is kind of, something to be proud of, or it's kind of viewed as manly. Kids aren't allowed to touch alcohol. It's taboo for children. It seems that type of drinking culture leads inevitably to abuses. You contrast that to the southern drinking culture. So what you find in Italy, Spain, places like that, they're drinking mostly beers and wines. They're drinking as families around the dinner table. You're only drinking at the dinner table. Everyone's having a little bit. So grandparents are drinking. The kids get a little bit of watered down wine in their glass. Drunkenness is frowned upon. Drinking to the point of being visibly drunk is considered kind of not an adult behavior. Right. In cultures like that, people drink in a more healthy way. And so, another takeaway is try to adopt more of a Southern drinking culture. So one thing I've done with my daughter's 15, is, introduce her to wine, a little bit of wine at an early age. So, by 14, I was letting her have a little bit of wine if it was good at dinner, get her to taste it. She's actually developed a really good palate. She's got, she doesn't have good vocabulary, but she actually has got a decent palate. And, she's seen that we drink wine around the dinner table, and it's something you do, but it's part of human life. And hopefully that will help. And she spent a lot. My ex-wife is half Italian, so she grew up spending a lot of time in Italy. So hopefully, having absorbed in various ways more of a Southern drinking culture, she'll be protected, I hope, against the kind of Northern binge drinking culture she's going to encounter when she goes to university. Right. So there are ways. It seems like it's been estimated that up to 15% of the population has a genetic propensity toward alcoholism. So there are a lot of people who have trouble drinking safely. Right. And yet actual levels of alcoholism really vary culture to culture. So very high in Russia and Scandinavia, and very low in places like Italy, even though they drink a lot of alcohol. Per capita consumption is quite high, but alcoholism rates are quite low. And it seems to be the case that some types of cultural practices give you this protective function against dangerous drinking.
And there seems like there's a correlation with latitude as well. That may have something to do with sunshine, but I can't prove causation there.
Yeah, right.
I've got two boys, 13 and 16, and we're going through that same kind of thing, trying to make sure that there's not a psychological benefit or thrill to the consumption itself, that it doesn't feel like there's a, like they are cheating or getting something over, or, this thrill shouldn't come from sneaking something, that's taboo.
Yeah.
If they want to enjoy it, they should enjoy it for what it is and understand, both the positives and the negatives of that. And, so far so good. It's still, it's still an experiment and process. But yeah, we'll see how that all works. Well, I think that's a great place to bring this to a close. G&D Chillers has set the mark for quality equipment you can rely on. BSG sources hops directly and processes them in a state-of-the-art facility in Yakima Valley. Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends mimic straight concentrates, but at a better price point. Arrived is the mobile all-in-one solution you need to decrease service friction and increase guest satisfaction, and put SS Brewtech's advances to work in your brewhouse. Your magazine subscription directly supports our ability to bring you this podcast each week. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button, and let us know that this content matters to you. Ted, if people want to learn more about the books that you've written, including Drunk, what you do, speaking engagements and whatnot, where do they find you? Where can they learn more about what you do?
EdwardSlingerland.com. Very simple URL. So I've got a website.
EdwardSlingerland.com. Yeah.
It's got all interviews, podcasts, things like that on there. Yep.
Well, fantastic. Again, your thesis connects with me as a endless cheerleader for craft beer in a very meaningful way. But I think that it's useful conversation for all of us in the world of craft beer to consider that that beer is not just a vice, that alcohol consumption is not just some negative that we put up with or allow to exist out here, but in fact, kind of a crucial piece of human evolution, and even a current, crucial piece of our ability to interact in community socially with each other. Thank you for writing the book. I encourage everybody to go out there and buy it and read it and support Edward Slingerland as an author. Thanks for joining me on the podcast. Cheers.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a lot of fun.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.